You're listening to an encore presentation of Life Talk with Wade Sorochan. Highlights of previous shows featuring special guests and open line discussions. Since this is a pre-recorded presentation, please do not call. And now, Live Talk with Wade Sorochan on AM 930, The Light.
Welcome back to the program. Well, the UN Summit on Climate Change is on now in Copenhagen as countries try to hammer out a deal to save our planet from harmful man-made CO2 emissions. Many scientists have convinced people and governments that if something isn't done now, it may be too late. But not everyone is convinced that climate change is man-made. Many believe scientists are exaggerating their findings, which the recent ClimateGate emails supposedly confirm. Well, Lord Christopher Monckton is a renowned climate change skeptic. He is a world-famous writer, columnist, business consultant, and inventor. He served as a policy advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher from 1982 to 1986. He has drawn attention to the lack of scientific consensus on climate change, calling it, and I quote, unscientific freedom-destroying nonsense, end quote. He sued to get the film The Great Climate Change Swindle shown in schools in the UK as an alternative to Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth. He has also challenged Al Gore to a series of debates to which Al Gore has never responded. Lord Monckton speaks at climate change conferences around the world, arguing that the theories of man-made global warming are deeply flawed in their science and have led to profoundly bad public policy. And joining me on the phone line right now is Lord Christopher Monckton. Lord Monckton, welcome to the program.
Wade, how good to hear you, and you should certainly do with some global warming in Alberta just now, by the sound of it.
You know what? That's right. If there is global warming, we need it here right in Alberta. It's pretty cold. You're right. And just for correction, are you in Copenhagen as we speak?
I'm actually striding through the very cold streets here. We've had snow all afternoon on a major Greenpeace demonstration. The good Lord has a sense of humour. There they were calling for more global warming to be brought to an end, and it was. They got snowed on.
No, there you go. Well, Lord Monckton, let's get right into it. First of all, why don't you just tell us again your general views on climate change?
Well, it's always been changing for 4.5 billion years. It always will change. Humankind's ability to affect it is minimal. And the idea that by adding a tiny fraction of CO2 to the atmosphere, we can somehow cause a major change in global temperatures, it's a nice thought. I wish we could, but of course we can't. It's been exaggerated in a number of very ingenious ways by a series of computer modelers, most of whom know nothing about the climate. And this disconnect between the computer models and the real world widens each year. We've now had 15 years without any statistically significant global warming. We've had 9 years with rapid and significant global cooling. And the fact is that nobody any longer believes that the UN's computer models can forecast the climate accurately. There isn't a problem with the climate caused by us. And what they should really do at this conference is go home and put their feet up with their families in front of a nice carbon-emitting fire.
Okay, so if they're, who is causing this climate change then? If what's you said it has been changing for all this time on the Earth, what is causing it then?
Well, it has been changing, of course, all this time. We've had 4.5 billion years of climate change ever since the Earth first formed. There's nothing new about this. Mm-hmm. It's something which we've long experienced, and even our ancestors experienced it. After all, I live in Rannoch in the Highlands, and there in Scotland there is a loch which was once a glacier 600 feet deep and about 600 feet high. It's now completely gone, and it went 9,000 years ago. And of course, the only automobiles at that time were Fred Flintstones.
Okay, you mentioned about scientists exaggerating. Why would scientists exaggerate global warming?
For money, power, and glory, for fame and fortune, just like anybody else. They've realized that we now have a population largely uneducated, either in the classics, so they can't spot the logical fallacies of saying just because a lot of people believe a thing, therefore it's true, or just because a lot of grand people believe it, therefore we must believe them. Those are well-known logical fallacies that Aristotle disposed of 2,000 years ago. But if you haven't had a classical education and you haven't had a scientific education, all the scientists have to do is put on a white coat, think up a scare, go to the politicians and say, here's the scare. If you don't deal with it, your generation will be held by future generations to blame for not having put it right. And so give us lots and lots and lots of taxpayers' money, and we will make this nasty scare go away for you. And so they're getting rich on this. It's really as simple as that.
Now, we keep hearing that it's the majority of the scientists who believe that it is a man-made global warming. 90, 98%. I keep hearing numbers like that. Where are these numbers coming from? And is it true that the majority of the scientists are on that side?
No. The truth is that of the 31, the biggest survey ever done of scientific opinion on this was done by my friend Dr. Art Robinson at the Oregon Institute for Science and Medicine. And he approached 31,000 scientists who each signed individually a declaration that they did not believe the results produced by the UN's climate change panel, the IPCC. 31,000 of them, of whom at least half were in relevant disciplines such as climatology, physics, mathematics, paleoclimatology, or geology. These were people who knew what they were talking about, and 31,000 of them said, this is all a load of rubbish. And that's the biggest survey of its kind that has ever been done worldwide.
Now, I'm always thinking, when it comes to scientists, I always think scientists should be open to opposing views. Why is it that these so-called scientists who are so pro-global warming and man-made emissions causing the problems, why are they so opposed to hearing opposing views?
Well, if you read the ClimateGate emails, which are the most revealing documents that have come out in public for a long time, these are emails between leading scientists over the last 10 years at all the major meteorological institutes around the world, all the people who have actually been writing the UN's climate documents. And it is these scientists, and they're very nasty people, this comes through. Everybody who reads the email says what nasty people they are. They have been deliberately distorting, fabricating, making up, inventing, twisting, turning, twiddling, tweaking the data. They've even been destroying it to prevent other people from checking what they've been doing. These scientists, so-called, have been working up this huge scare, and they've been getting away with it until now, simply because they can. Nobody finds it very easy to challenge them. But the fact is, they are just making it up, because they don't know a lot of what they claim. They say, we can tell you exactly what effect CO2 has on temperature. They can't. There are far too many unknowns in the equation, and anyone who's ever handled equations in many unknown variables will know how extremely difficult it is to get any sensible answer out. And the fact is, they simply don't know the answer. But they pretend that they do know. They say, if the answer has been given to us by a large enough computer model, then it must be right. Well, no, it doesn't have to be right. And that's the big problem. They're relying too much on computer models and too little on observation. And we now know, by measurement, that the outgoing radiation that ought to be trapped down here and causing warming is escaping to space very much as it always did. How do we know? By measurement, not by some stupid model. By measurement, not by an Xbox 360. We've had a satellite up there for 25 years watching the outgoing radiation change as temperature changes. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, as the surface warms down here, more radiation gets out to space, not less, as all the UN's models predict. They've simply been programmed to predict it wrong. Now that we know what the measured facts are, the scare is over. And it's just going to be time for these 24 scientists who are driving the scare to learn that the game is up. And as I said this evening to R.K. Pachauri, who is the chairman of the IPCC, I said, the days of your fraud are over. He had produced a fraudulent graph in a lecture, and I interrupted him and said, you cannot use that graph. It is a fraud. You ought to know it's a fraud. And he was very upset. He said, surely fraud is not a very parliamentary word. I said, look, mate, you've got 48 hours to withdraw that graph from the IPCC's documents, or I'm going to the Danish police. And he looked really shocked, because they've got so used to being able to just tell lies that they've drifted along in a kind of fog, believing their own propaganda. Now, suddenly, I've confronted him. I gave him a letter explaining the nature of the fraud, how I'd caught him out in it, how much money he's making from his various business interests connected with this, the conflict of interest between his post as chairman of the IPCC and chairman of the Tata Steel Industries Energy Research Institute, which has a subsidiary that at the moment is bidding for a $3 million contract for repairing Kuwait after the oil field fires. And guess who that contract is being awarded by? The UN, of which he is a senior official. And this is how the money goes round.
So,
and people are now beginning to follow the money, and they're beginning to say, we're not prepared to tolerate bogus science from people who are profiting from this bogus science. Those days are now over.
And, okay, now, are you officially speaking at this, or are you just showing up at these meetings? And
No, I have spoken at 3 official meetings here, one in the Danish Parliament,
Yep.
which was kindly attended by the Speaker of the Danish Parliament, who has now realized what rubbish all this is. I've spoken at the Architectural Institute of Denmark in front of one of the most distinguished gatherings of scientists I've ever had the privilege to address. Not one of them believes in this nonsense. And I've also addressed a meeting at the Centre for Policy Studies here, which is for young people from the Scandinavian area. And again, not one of them believes in this nonsense. The tide is definitely turning.
And do you think ClimateGate is the cause of bringing this open now, and is going to harm the global warming movement?
It has done untold harm to them, despite the best efforts of the mainstream news media not to really mention it. Even now, the BBC has not said what is in even one of these emails. They can't bring themselves to. They realize that they have been backing the wrong horse all these years. They're still, I spoke to a very dopey BBC reporter today called Roger Harrabin, who came bounding up and said, "Are you making converts?" I said, "What the heck do you think this is? Some kind of religious convention?" I said, "I'm here to exchange ideas with eminent scientists from around the world, to learn a bit more about this, and to go back and report to the people who like to hear what I have to say on these matters. I'm not here to convert people." And I said to him, now that ClimateGate's happened, you can't go on believing what you believe about this, because science is not a belief system. And he said, "Oh, but there's a consensus." And they all fall back on this. They haven't bothered to check whether there's a consensus. Greenpeace has put out a handout saying there's a consensus, and the BBC and the mainstream media have simply gone along with it. What is quite clear is we now know this so-called consensus from the ClimateGate emails is driven by just 24 people, very highly placed around the world, who are talking to each other on a daily basis over the last 10 years, working out how they can fiddle and fudge and bend and make up and destroy the data so as to fool us into thinking a non-problem is a real problem.
All right. Well, we're talking with Lord Christopher Monckton, a renowned climate change skeptic, and we want to open up the phone lines and get your thoughts as well at 780-430-9300 or 1-877-827-2346, using words like fraud, bogus science, all motivated by money. What do you think? And has this so-called ClimateGate broken the lid off the can of worms, as it were? And Lord Monckton, we have, this is such a strong movement, and Al Gore is leading this movement, and you have everyone from kindergarten kids to seniors with the placards saying, "Save our planet, save our planet." A very strong movement, and you see that this movement can actually be convinced that what they're believing is bogus science?
Well, I don't think you can convince true believers in a superstition that their superstition is wrong. What you can do is just quietly go on asserting what the real science is actually saying, until eventually enough people hear it to realize that listening to school kids and getting your science from them is not appropriate. I interviewed a Greenpeace protester in Berlin a few weeks ago, and I said to her, "Where do you get your science from?" She clearly didn't know any. "Oh," she said, "I get it from my kids." And she didn't, and her kids were aged 8 and 10 or something. And that is how, at the moment, people are getting their climate science. The teachers are propagandizing the kids. The kids are going home and saying to their parents, "You're ruining the planet for our generation." And the parents are believing it. That's how stupid it is. And so what I simply quietly try to do is to make the true science available, to go to people like R.K. Pachauri and say to him, "Look, if you think you can go on getting away with using bogus graphs and making money by putting in bids for UN contracts when you are a UN official, well, you can't, because in the end, I'm going to go," he's got 48 hours to sort this out, "if that graph is not withdrawn from the UN's documents, I will be going to the Danish police on Friday."
And we're talking with Lord Christopher Monckton, a renowned climate change skeptic, and your calls. Let's get to the phone lines and say hi to John. Hello, John.
Hi, how are you, Wade?
Hey, doing well, John. You're on with Lord Monckton.
Okay. I just wanted to comment on, the state of the earth and the pollution and, what we all know.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically, I think if we haven't realized by now that maybe we can, that governments can't and they won't change the amount of pollutants that we put out and the way we live. and that I suggest and put a call out to the body of Christ that it's going to be up to us to help for the children, to ensure that they can go and fish in lakes and eat the fish that they catch, and even breathe the air.
I think, well, you're right about governments, John. I mean, news out today that there's even some world leaders who may be boycotting the summit there because they're already sensing failure. So, Lord Moncton, are you finding that there's so much disunity amongst leaders that they even if they want to have an agreement, it doesn't look very good at this point?
I think there's going to be an agreement because there's been so much political capital invested by the political class worldwide in getting something that they can call an agreement. Yes, of course, that's what they're going to do. But the agreement won't be anything like as substantial as they wanted. They're going to set up institutions of a world government, but they're not going to call it a world government yet because they know that people are not ready for that. I've been saying that this is a bad idea, and people on the whole have been agreeing with me, so they're not going to allow that. Now, as to the point about pollution, which your questioner quite fairly raised, we must draw distinctions here between pollution, which is a bad idea and which most Western countries have dealt with on the whole very successfully and minimum, and emitting CO2, which is a harmless natural trace gas, which has been present for most of the last 600 million years at 1,000 parts per million or more, and now it's only 400 parts per million, which is almost too little for plants and trees to be at their best. And if we were to double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, as we will this century, if we don't cut our emissions back, we'll double it compared with the year 2000. Will this do any harm? No, it won't. It will help crops to grow about 41% more effectively and with less water than if we tried to keep CO2 low. So we have to distinguish between CO2, which is a harmless natural trace gas that won't cause very much global warming, even if we do double its concentration, and other forms of pollution which are serious, but which, of course, are not being addressed here by the UN today. Yeah,
thank you for your call, John. That's a good point, Lord Moncton, is that, CO2 is very important to our planet, and through the whole global warming, movement, they're making it sound like this is such a bad thing. We need to eliminate, reduce, but yet it is so important to our planet.
Exactly. It is vital to the planet that we allow more CO2 to be emitted. It's actually vital to us, too, because if you want to lift people out of poverty, and that's the first thing you need to do, cheap electricity does it faster than anything. And the cheapest way to generate electricity is with the plentiful fossil fuels that we have in almost all the nations of the world. They've got supplies of coal or oil or gas or even all three. And these are the things we should be using now so as to lift people out of poverty, stabilize their populations, and so get the population into balance with the resources, and then everything settles down, and if you like, we can then minimize the total environmental footprint of humankind on the planet. That would be the responsible and sensible way to go. But of course, none of that is on the agenda here at Copenhagen. Here they've decided to demonize CO2, not because it is actually dangerous, not because any scientist any longer seriously believes that it is, but simply because this is a wonderful regime for introducing rationing, control, interference, and in particular, this is targeted, this whole treaty is targeted at the United States and at Canada, and at Alberta in particular.
Yep.
In all the areas where they process the oil sands, and I know that you've got huge environmental issues locally over that, but I tell you it's an awful lot cleaner to use that than to go back to the sort of methods they're using in Africa where they're having to cut down precious timber, burn it in smoke-filled huts, having carried it on their backs all day, and the children die of respiratory diseases. That's not a good way to allow Africa to develop. Fossil fuels would be better. And if the tar sands are one way of getting those fossil fuels, then for heaven's sake, use them now while you've got them, because that will do mankind far better than if you don't use them and allow people to go hungry and cold for lack of electricity.
Well, if not man-made through CO2 emissions, how about man-made through massive deforestation?
Well, now that is a serious environmental problem. And that is one of the environmental problems on the agenda here, not in its own right, but because it is thought to have an influence on how much CO2 is knocking around in the atmosphere. But, of course, that's a problem quite separately, which very much needs to be addressed. I was talking to the Prince of Wales about this the other day, and I begged him, stop wasting your time with this climate nonsense and try and concentrate on deforestation, because there is a real problem. And I think, funnily enough, one of the things that might usefully come out of this conference, and may actually usefully come out of it, is they now have quite an important program to try and help the countries that at the moment are finding it profitable and sometimes even necessary to cut down their forests, to try to persuade them not to do so. And, of course, these are the big rainforests around the tropical belt of the world, which are, of course, a haven of biodiversity. Most of our medicines originate in plants that came from these forests. They're full of wildlife of every kind. Timber itself is valuable, and indeed you can get a larger yield of protein out of these forests in their natural state than you can by cutting them down and putting them down to crops. And these things are gradually being learnt and understood around the world, and so there really will be a chance, I think, at this conference to address the question of deforestation, albeit that the reason why they're addressing it, which is to do with CO2, is a completely bogus and pointless reason.
Right. Okay, let's get back to the phone lines and talk to Burke. Hello, Burke, you're on the air.
Hey. Hi, Wade. I want to throw in my vote with Lord Moncton there, because I heard him the other day, and I agree. I have agreed with him for about a year and a half, and I think one of the biggest, cruelest tricks is foisting these compact fluorescent bulbs on us, and in fact, I believe in the United Kingdom now it's illegal to sell the regular light bulbs, the incandescent. Is that true?
That's quite right. And Bert, I'm very grateful for your support, and I'm very grateful to you for raising this particular question of the light bulbs, because it is a very serious environmental problem. These light bulbs contain one of the most dangerous metals known to man, namely mercury, and in its most dangerous possible form, which is mercury vapor. And if you drop one of these bulbs in a small room and you then take a breath, it can kill you. And I don't know how they ever got away with even allowing these things on health and safety grounds to be entering into any house. The other thing is, of course, they give out far less light per unit of electricity than the incandescent bulbs do. And the only reason they get away with selling them is that they've rated them in a different way, so you think that you're getting more light than you actually are getting. But everybody I know who's got them finds that it's virtually impossible to read or sew or do anything that requires close work with the eyes with these bulbs. So what we've done is, before the ban came in, we bought a lorry load of the old type of bulbs, and we should be able to last the next 30 years without having to go to these hideous, dangerous, mercury-filled pieces of nonsense.
All right, we're talking...
Which, of course, are an environmental disaster. Once you start putting these into landfills, there's going to be the most appalling poisoning that will result from having allowed these mercury lights into everybody's house. It's an environmental disaster brought upon us by the environmental movement.
All right, Lord Christopher Moncton is my guest, renowned climate change skeptic. We need to take a quick break here, Lord Moncton. We'll take more calls when we come back here on Life Talk at 780-430-9300, 1-877-827-2346. The question is, where do you stand on the issue of climate change? We're back with your calls and Lord Moncton right after this.